All right. So, what I'm going to talk about is just my framework that I use for treating addiction. It's also very relevant to OCD in a lot of cases and just kind of general good counseling approaches, even if it's not for addiction necessarily. It's an emotion focused approach that is focusing on avoidance. I kind of like the idea of what is sometimes called emotional debt. I don't really use that language too much with clients just because the idea of being in debt can be kind of a condemning idea, but I think conceptually it works. So there is this part in King Arthur in the quest for the Holy Grail where the group of knights they get to a forest and decide that they need to split up to finish the quest to find the Grail. And they commit to entering that forest in the place that seems most dark and pathless to them personally. And that sort of picture of literature endures because there's a psychological truth to the fact that often what you need to find the most is located where you least want to look. And when it comes to emotions that are painful or uncomfortable or experiences of trauma, addiction works in the opposite direction in that it builds up an avoidance pathway of those things. So this is a cycle that is it's kind of an ERP, exposure and response prevention based cycle that also integrates some other elements. So first you got a trigger. That's something that essentially stirs up an emotion or a sensation, a physical reaction of some kind. A lot of these frameworks put meaning and interpretation after that, which I think is oftentimes the wrong order because emotional reactions, body sensations, they often arrive first after a trigger. Then perhaps is more where the meaning and interpretation of the thought or belief about that feeling comes about. Those two things create discomfort, and then there's a compulsive escape, whatever that might be. It could be substances, pornography, overworking, just anything that serves to avoid that emotional sensation and find distraction. That brings about temporary relief, which trains the nervous system that that behavior works for coping, and then the cycle becomes reinforced. Uh, the part where ERP fits into this, that exposure and response prevention, is it is exposing the client to that emotional activation, but not engaging in the compulsive escape that reinforces the cycle. The problem with a lot of addiction treatments is they only do that piece of things. And if you only do that part of things, you leave the client without their kind of main coping and they're kind of drowning in that emotional activation and the difficulty of the meanings and interpretations they have put on that. So, where I often implement EMDR, it's kind of helping to work on that body sensation, emotional memory, all of that stuff that the addiction is serving to cope with instead of just leaving clients to process that without that coping tool. Um, so, processing distressing experiences, EMDR originally a trauma treatment, but also works for just kind of any experience that is internalized into the body, into the belief system and identity of the client, working on fully processing that, processing those emotions, and having relief that helps with not engaging in that behavior. Yeah, so there is another quote by Marcus Aurelius, the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. And even if it is not as intense as kind of like a macro trauma that we might be treating with EMDR, that voluntary approach of discomfort actually becomes the mechanism in which the client is growing their tolerance for that distress. They are coming to see themselves from a different perspective in what they went through. So when we talk about emotional debt and what has been left unfaced, that emotional debt is not actually the enemy per se, and it doesn't all necessarily have to be resolved. Something that happens in EMDR often that is pretty significant is there is processing of that emotion, but there is also a shift in the client's just experience of themselves in perspective to what they have been through. And so that can be changes in the way they see themselves with their identity, the ability to overcome those things, to see what was permanent and strengths about themselves, just coming to understand the situation from a different perspective. This is where kind of DBT kind of fits into things as well. So initially just creating awareness around those emotions. So that can be things as simple as just the feeling wheel, kind of reducing that alexithymia, creating that emotional fluency, the ability to name and recognize things in the moment. Even that can be a shift in perspective. Um, Tolerance, that's kind of window of tolerance, slowly growing the ability to cope with discomfort to greater degrees as the ability of the client is growing, but kind of pacing the treatment to not put them outside of that window, which is a relapse risk if it goes too fast. Engagement, that's why I love group stuff for addiction. Lee, it's awesome that you're doing recovery groups for teens. I think that's been a missing part of that side of things for a long time. So that's pretty exciting. Connection, whether that's in group support or just growing kind of community, because addiction has a way of making life small, and part of recovering from that is expanding just the networks of people you're in, the connections you have, just the size of your life in general. And throughout that process, there is just growth in the ability to tolerate those things. And what I often notice about people who have worked through an addiction is just the level of honesty, of inventory, like the immense moral journey that it becomes to put all of that in place can create people with exceptional character. And someone who has worked through an addiction recovery can have a strength of character that is hard to come by and very respectable. Just a good fit for this type of therapy. People who have a lot of cognitive sort of insight, but are just trapped in the cycles despite the willingness to change. So, in the kind of motivational interviewing framework, they would be kind of towards the action phase, but struggling to figure that out. All right. Thank you.